Hello, everybody. Half a day. Welcome. Gwahusi Rob Arnold. I'm the executive director of Poets House, and I am so grateful to welcome all of you into our home tonight. And thank you so much for braving the weather out there. You are the true poetry fans. So really appreciate it. And hello and welcome to everybody who's joining us online as well. We're so happy to have you. Poets House is a library and cultural space with a mission to expand access to and deepen the conversation around the art of poetry. We do that through public programs like this evening's. We do that through our collection of over 100,000 books of poetry upstairs. If you haven't had a chance to explore it, I invite you to come and spend some time up there. It's pretty amazing. And we do that through educational opportunities that connect folks of all ages with poetic expression. And we all do that all in partnership with funders like the New York State Council for the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the Battery Park City Authority, and particularly the Battery Park City Authority, who have offered critical support for our public programs, and including our Password series. So please join me in thanking them for that. Passwords is a long-standing Poets House series that features one poet discussing the work of another poet or poetic tradition, creating a thought-provoking dialogue on the art of poetry across time, space, and influence. And tonight's Password lecture features the poet Jake Skeets, presenting on the inimitable Joy Harjo, specifically her collection, She Had Some Horses, as well as Harjo's use of recursive structures, accumulative sequencing, and long architectures that name the poem as a site of futurity. I feel like I'm using your language when I say that, Jake. That sounds very much like Jake. Jake's poems are gorgeously thoughtful, deeply lyrical explorations centering land and the body, specifically the queer indigenous body, within that landscape. He's the author of 2 books of poetry, Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, winner of the National Poetry Series, the American Book Award, Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and the Whiting Award, as well as the highly anticipated second collection titled Horses, just out from Milkweed Books. His work has appeared in journals and magazines such as Poetry, the New York Times Magazine, and the Paris Review. Other honors include an NEA grant for arts projects, rest in peace, a Mellon Projecting All Voices Fellowship, and the 2023-2024 Grisham Writer in Residence at the University of Mississippi. He's the 3rd Navajo Nation Poet Laureate and teaches at the University of Oklahoma. And Joy Harjo, I will read Joy's brief bio, is an internationally renowned performer and writer of the Muskogee Nation. She served 3 terms as the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2019 to 2022, and is a winner of the Poetry Society of America's 2024 Frost Medal, Yale's 2023 Bollingen Prize for American Poetry, and was recently honored with a National Humanities Medal. After Jake's lecture, we'll conduct a brief Q&A, and there will be a book signing to follow. We have books for sale in the lobby, both Joy's and Jake's. So now it is my great pleasure to welcome Jake Skeets to the stage.
Yeah, we are about the same height, so that's good. I think I'm a little taller. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yat a she Matthew Jake Skeets sinin she. Akon de Jake Skeets da shijine. Sinajin na shle do tobahan bashish chin tkachini da shiche do tworik ojen da shinella. And what that translates to from Dene is I'm Jake, and I'm from the Navajo Nation. And I am pretty tired and flustered a little bit because of traveling, but I'm here, I made it. And it's actually quite interesting that a storm is happening right now, because I come from Oklahoma, where storms are a natural part of the rhythm there in Oklahoma. Storms like this are, very common, especially in the month of May. And it's actually quite fitting that a storm is happening right now, because I feel like being in a place like Oklahoma, which is Joy's homelands, I am always in awe of the way in which weather works, and I think I do talk a little bit about weather, perhaps in this talk. But some housekeeping things about this talk. I tried to make it as not academic as possible, only because I feel like I wanted it to be more conversational in tone. But I think the way my brain works sort of leans a bit toward the academic or some of that language that Rob had mentioned earlier. But so to maintain my sanity, I'm specifically going to talk about the title poem, She Had Some Horses, and maybe do some brief sort of broad overview of the book itself. But really, it's more just a personal narrative of my relationship with Joy Harjo. But if you're unfamiliar, the title poem, She Had Some Horses, is actually a 5-part poem in total. It's this 5-part sequence that is near the end of the book. The poem, the part that is most sort of shown in excerpts, or the part that is the one that is most maybe that you are probably familiar with, is the beginning part, or the first section, which is, she had some horses. And to sort of maintain my sanity as I'm sort of working through this particular discussion, I'm going to just use the sections of the poem She Had Some Horses to also title and section this talk as well. So, of course, I'm going to start first with the first part. 1, She Had Some Horses. And I think to start, I want to read a little bit of the poem, just to get us going in the world and realm and rhythm of Joy Harjo. She Had Some Horses by Joy Harjo. She had some horses. She had horses who were bodies of sand. She had horses who were maps drawn of blood. She had horses who were skins of ocean water. She had horses who were the blue air of sky. She had horses who were fur and teeth. She had horses who were clay and would break. She had horses who were splintered red cliff. She had some horses. She had horses with eyes of trains. She had horses with full brown thighs. She had horses who laughed too much. She had horses who threw rocks at glass houses. She had horses who licked razor blades. She had some horses. She had horses who danced in their mother's arms. She had horses who thought they were the sun, and their bodies shone and burned like stars. She had horses who waltzed nightly on the moon. She had horses who were much too shy and kept quiet in stalls of their own making. She had some horses. She had horses who liked creek stomp songs. She had horses who cried in their beer. She had horses who spit at male queens who made them afraid of themselves. She had horses who said they weren't afraid. She had horses who lied. She had horses who told the truth, who were stripped bare of their tongues. She had some horses. She had horses who called themselves horse. She had horses who called themselves spirit and kept their voices secret and to themselves. She had horses who had no names. She had horses who had books of names. She had some horses. She had horses who whispered in the dark, who were afraid to speak. She had horses who screamed out of the fear of the silence, who carried knives to protect themselves from ghosts. She had horses who waited for destruction. She had horses who waited for resurrection. She had some horses. She had horses who got down on their knees for any savior. She had horses who thought their high price had saved them. She had horses who tried to save her, who climbed in her bed at night and prayed. She had some horses. She had some horses she loved. She had some horses she hated. These were the same horses. So that's the first part of the title poem. And I also wanted to just briefly talk a bit about sort of my work and the kind of context that I'm going to talk about this particular poem. So as was mentioned, my new book is called Horses, and I just briefly want to acknowledge the title. She had some horses. I also want to bring in a few other folks. Lucy Tapahanso's Blue Horses for Navajo Woman was a poetry collection that really inspired my book. Another book, Nia Francisco's. I got that mixed up. I'm sorry. So Lucy Tapahanso's book is called Blue Horses Rush In, and Nia Francisco's book is called Blue Horses for Navajo Woman. And of course, I can't not mention Patti Smith's album Horses, because of the way in which I was really interested in endurance in this book. And I think I learned it from Joy Harjo a bit about endurance. So I'm just going to read a brief sort of contextual, just really briefly. So in 2018, approximately 191 horses were found dead at a stock pond on the Navajo Nation. The horses were identified as feral horses, wild horses, or free roaming horses. Stock ponds are used as water stations for roaming livestock in what has been called an arid landscape. The stock pond where the horses were found was near Gray Mountain in northern Arizona. It had been dry because of the extreme drought the Navajo Nation is facing, caused by decades-long aggression by the United States and the changing climate. The horses were found thigh and neck deep in the mud, some horses on top of other horses. And I quote from former Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez, "These animals were searching for water to stay alive. In the process, they unfortunately burrowed themselves into the mud and couldn't escape because they were so weak." The horses were found in a circle, mud-caked in their coats. Some horses were found upright as if running. The Navajo Nation, as a response, sprayed the horses with hydrated lime to speed up decomposition and buried the horses on site. Today, the feral horse problem is contributing to the drought conditions of the Navajo Nation. One horse survived, and her name is Grace. The horses in a circle, gathering, gathering, gathering. And I think I'm going to pull this off. And I want to begin with a question to maybe frame my thinking tonight. What do the horses mean? Horses are a large part of the American mythos. Right? We think of horses as wild beasts or wild animals that roam the frontier. We might think of an image of a horse galloping across the plains in the central United States or along a sandy beach in the west. In Diné or Navajo, horses are sound, or rather, they are named through sound. The Diné word for horse is tli. The word tli has no translation other than horse. It doesn't describe the horse, but rather describes the sound a horse makes. So the question, what do the horses mean, is a question asked of Joy Harjo, as she notes in the introduction to the poetry collection, She Had Some Horses. First published in 1984, the question of horses and their meaning have mystified readers for decades now. I first met Joy Harjo in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was a poor college student studying to be a poet. And poetry is a practice I first discovered through sound. I remember following the rhythm of Emily Dickinson, and then finally native poets like Joy Harjo, and others like Lucy Tapahanso, Nia Francisco, Simon Ortiz, and Sherwin Bitsui. Joy was part of a reading with Tanaya Winder at the University of New Mexico bookstore. Together, they read from the book Soul Talk, Soul Language. When it was time for Q&A, I remember I asked Joy a question. What do the horses mean? No, that wasn't the question, because I have an idea of what the horses might mean, given that I wrote an entire book around horses too. I don't remember the exact question I asked her, but it was enough to have her remember me. And I used the last of my money to buy the book so she and Tanaya could sign it for me. When it was my turn to get my book signed, I nervously introduced myself. That was a good question, Joy had said. She then inscribed in my book, Poetry is about listening. After the event, I sat on stone steps opposite the bookstore and began reading the book, when suddenly I heard a voice call out my name. It was Joy with her family, and she was waving me over. Do you want a burger? Joy asked. I nervously nodded as she walked with me over to the Frontier restaurant. Originally, next to the Frontier in Albuquerque was a bookstore called the Living Batch Bookstore that is part of the long history of writing in Albuquerque and the American Southwest. Often overlooked, New Mexico has been home for some of the best literary traditions. The Living Batch hosted readings for so many incredible writers, including Robert Creeley, who called Albuquerque home for quite some time. Rooted in this legacy are some of the first Native writers to explode onto the American literary scene in an era known as the American Literary Renaissance, which included writers like Harjo, N. Scott Mamade, Leslie Marmon Silko, and James Welch. I was first introduced to Harjo's work in high school. I was in a college prep English class. It wasn't an AP English class that I was normally taking. In fact, when I got to this high school, they looked at my math scores and thought I'd be good in refrigeration repair as opposed to an academic track. But my mom and myself advocated, and they developed what they called a college prep English class. And my teacher, Miss Chi, handed out a packet of Native American poets. And the first poem on the packet was She Had Some Horses. In the introduction to the book, Harjo states that the horses are just horses. In my own book, the horses are also just horses. Harjo writes, like most poets, I don't really know what my poems or the stuff of my poetry means exactly. That's not the point. It never was the point. I am aware of stepping into a force field or dream field of language, of sound. Each journey is different, just as the ocean or the sky is never the same from one day to another. I am engaged by the music, by the deep, and I got, so I'm engaged by the music, end quote. And it's here I'm interested in the notion of field, as Harjo says, a force field, a dream field. In She Had Some Horses, I'm wondering how the poem might not just be a moment of experience or meaning, but then again, what do the horses mean? And I'm thinking that maybe the horses are an active and long architecture of becoming. The horses themselves are in constant transformation throughout the book. When much of Western lyric tradition imagines the poem as a finished object, i.e. a single utterance, a completed insight, or an emotion fully bloomed open on the page, Harjo's poems often refuse such closure. Through her use of repetition, meaning is not delivered once. Meaning instead is accumulated through motion, almost like the weather. And I'm not a neat thinker by any means, and I put this in here because I'm not a neat thinker at all, but this talk is actually sort of making it seem like I am, perhaps. But I tend to sort of meander my thoughts really across the page as if I'm already doubting what I'm saying. But perhaps that's the kind of container within which a native poem ought to exist. One with no fixed logic, but rather a logic of becoming. But to maybe neatly put it, and this is where I could sound the most academic, hopefully, I'm interested in returning to Harjo's She Had Some Horses and the question of what do the horses mean through three ideas: recursive structures, sequencing, and long architectures, and the ways in which they might position the poem as a site of futurity. And I'm not really one to argue, but I think Harjo's poetics enact a kind of indigenous conception of time and poetic space, i.e., as she puts it, a dream field of language, a dream field of sound. And this field is nonlinear. This field is relational, cyclical, and ongoing, or beauty everlasting, as we might say in the Ne way of thinking. The poem becomes the field. Of course, this is not new. I think of poets like Barbara Guest, who wondered a poem's invisible architecture, or Charles Osen and his manifesto projective verse. And this is the second section, Two Horses. And I'll read the poem, some of the poem again. I thought the sun breaking through Sangre de Cristo mountains was enough, and that wild, musky sense on my body after long nights of dreaming could unfold me to myself. I thought my dance alone through worlds of odd and eccentric planets that no one else knew would sustain me. I mean, I did learn to move after all, and how to recognize voices other than the most familiar. But you must have grown out of 1,000 years dreaming, just like I could never imagine you. You must have broke open from another sky to hear, because now I see you as part of the millions of other universes that I thought could never occur in this breathing. And I know you as myself, traveling. In your eyes alone are many colonies of stars and other circling planet motion, and then your fingers, the sweet smell of hair, and your soft, tight belly. My heart is taken by you. And these mornings, since I am a horse running towards a cracked sky where there are countless dawns breaking simultaneously, there are two moons on the horizon, and for you, I have broken loose. Again, this is the second section of She Had Some Horses. And again, the horses return. And they specifically return after a sequence in the first section. She had some horses, she had some horses, she had some horses. And I'm wondering how the poem, through the revisiting of a single horse, is already arguing for me that the poem is refusing a singular identity, and that the horse here ought to exist as an emotional state, as situated in the line, my heart is taken by you, and these mornings since I am a horse running towards a cracked sky. In this line, the horse becomes the speaker, and therefore carries to that speaker's histories, genders, ancestors, violences, and even nations. I think then Harjo's use of recursive structure employs repetition as a means to generate expansion rather than redundancy. And I was really inspired by this move because I too leaned heavy into return and echo in my book as a means to possibly unlock that expansion. In my book, this culminates with a sestina at the end of the book, which is also another way I'm honoring the poet Lucy Tapahanso. Both Tapahanso and Harjo taught at the University of New Mexico, and I feel, not to sound like woo-woo about it at all, that this is the universe's divine nature that I'm actually following in their footsteps this fall. But back to the question, what do the horses mean? I was really worried about how many times I repeat the word horse in my own book. But Harjo and her frequent repetition of certain images is not marred by excess, but rather endurance. Perhaps a means of pointing toward a continuance or survival. I think this might make up the recursive line. The recursive line is one prevalent in indigenous poetics because repetition is often an act of relationality, as it's borrowed from ceremonial language that often depends on return. The recursive line then imports an indigenous temporality into a contemporary lyric space. The recursive line then, as a byproduct of all this maneuvering on the page by Harjo and other native and indigenous poets, resists a settler temporality that often paints native and indigenous people as anti-progress. Because a settler temporality must always insist on progress, on linearity, on extraction, on conclusion, on destination. So Harjo's recursive structures insist on return, on carrying, on remaining in a state of becoming and being in relation. And this is the third part. It's titled Drowning Horses. And this is from Harjo's poem again. She says she is going to kill herself. I am 1,000 miles away, listening to her voice in an ocean of telephone sound, gray sky and nearly sundown. I don't ask her how. I am already familiar with the weapons. A restaurant that wouldn't serve her, the thinnest laughter, another drink. And even if I weren't closer to the cliff edge of the talking wire, I would still be another mirror, another running horse. Her escape is my own. I tell her, yes, yes, we ride out for breath over the distance. Night air approaches the galloping other life. No sound, no sound. And in this part, and maybe through this section specifically, I want to take a look at the poem, but maybe also about the book itself. I think one of the most important craft lessons of She Had Some Horses is that sequencing is compositional, meaning the poems are not existing one after another, but are actually placing pressure upon each other. In this way, the poetry book is not just a storage unit for poems. Instead, the poems are in conversation. Native and indigenous poets have often called this a process of energy transfer, which is also what Olson, Robert Creeley, or even Denise Levertov might say too. And of course, not to sound too academic about it, but Harjo understands accumulative sequencing as a relational ecology. By this, I mean, I think the images migrate across poems. No horse is the same as the other horse. No bird, no river, no woman, no violence. The craft instinct might be to, quote, say it new. But often the plain spoken word might best serve the image after all. And I think of the poet Arthur Z, who once said that no word has hierarchy over another word. So imagine the sequencing in the book as a kind of motif. And I'm particularly moved by the idea of the book as a breath structure of expansion, compression, expansion, and release, similar to how air moves in our bodies. The sequencing modulates as we move from poem to poem, between long and short poems, between dense and chant-like verses to ones more spacious. The silences between them just as important as the text itself. In this section, I'm particularly drawn to the end of the poem, the yearning for breath, the galloping to it, only to find no sound. I believe this enacts a kind of pressure on the entire poem, on the entire book, and maybe even my entire thinking, because futurity was something I was trying to work toward. In fact, I was trying to work toward futurity in my own book, Horses. I believe Harjo and I do find it, and we find it still, while honoring that breath does sometimes end. And this brings me to the final two sections of the poem. So this is section 4 and section 5, and I'll just read it, and then I'll talk a little bit about it at the end. 4. Ice horses. These are the ones who escape after the last hurt is turned inward. They are the most dangerous ones. These are the hottest ones, but so cold that your tongue sticks to them and is torn apart because it is frozen to the motion of hooves. These are the ones who cut your thighs, whose blood you must have seen on the gloves of the doctor's rubber hands. They are the horses who moaned like oceans, and one of them, a young woman, screamed aloud. She was the only one. These are the ones who have found you. These are the ones who pranced on your belly. They chased deer out of your womb. These are the ice horses, horses who entered through your head and then your heart, your beaten heart. These are the ones who loved you. They are the horses who have held you so close that you have become a part of them, an ice horse galloping into fire. And this is the last section of She Had Some Horses. 5. Explosion. The highway near Okima, Oklahoma exploded. There are reasons for everything. Maybe there is a new people coming forth, being born from the center of the earth, like us, but another tribe. Maybe they will be another color that no one has ever seen before. Then they might be hated and live in Muskogee on the side of the tracks that Indians leave on, and they will be the ones to save us. Maybe there are lizards coming out of rivers of lava from the core of this planet, coming to bring rain, to dance for the corn, to set fields of tongue slapping at the dark earth, a kind of dance. But maybe the explosion was horses bursting out of the crazy earth near Okima. They were a violent birth, flew from the ground into trees to wait for evening, nightmares to come after them. Then into the dank, wet fields of Oklahoma. Then their birth cords tied into molten heart. Then they travel north and south, east and west. Then into wet wild sheets at midnight when everyone sleeps and the baby dreams of swimming in the bottom muggy river. Then into frogs who have come out of the earth to sea for rain. then a Creek woman who dances, shaking the seeds in her bones, then South Dakota, Mexico, Japan, and Manila, then into Miami to sweep away the knived faces of hatred. Some will not see them, but some will see the horses with their hearts of sleeping volcanoes and will be rocked awake past their bodies to see who they have become. And here I'm thinking specifically about horses as a kind of future movement. The horse in this collection is never singularly symbolic. The horses operate as mobile consciousness. They carry grief, they carry gender, they carry desire, they carry ancestral memory, historical violence, possibility. But I think what's most importantly about the horses in Harjo's work is that they move. Motion itself becomes survival. And this movement accumulates toward futurity. The repeated horse, or the word horse, creates a collective field of becoming. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is the way in which contemporary poets like myself can learn from Harjo's techniques. I'm thinking specifically about the way repetition must transform. What changes each time a phrase returns? The recursive line should gather new emotional weather and shouldn't merely echo itself. I'm really particularly interested also as sequence, a sort of sequence as composition. Not only think about a book as poem situated by poem, but rather think about resonance, pacing, silence, recurrence, and specifically the way in which an image might migrate across the page, across pages, across the book, across books, across voices, across communities. Because I think a book teaches readers how to inhabit its own temporality and its own logics. And of course, I'm particularly interested in this idea of a long architecture or a long poem that requires a particular kind of energy. In fact, when my first book, Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, came out, I made the mistake of reading Goodreads reviews of it. And one of the Goodreads reviews stated, Jake Skeets, or Eyes Bottled Dark, is like a normal poetry collection, but cut in half. And Jake Skeets can't write a long poem to save himself. But I'm particularly interested in the way in which the gesture of a long poem insists on its own existence, in the ways in which a short poem does not, maybe. But through Harjo, and in this book, and just despite that reviewer who left that Goodreads review, I was particularly interested in the long poem in my own work. And one thing I learned from Harjo is that a long poem survives, again, through motion, through modulation, that there are moments of image density, there are moments of sonic variation, there are many moments of pivot and rhythmic pivots, and of course, tonal shifts. Length alone is not an architecture, and what I learned really is that movement is. And one of the things I'm particularly drawn to from She Had Some Horses overall as a book is that the poem can create a temporal alternative, that native and indigenous poetics is really showing us the way of time, the way time can move across a poem, the way time can move across a book, and maybe perhaps move across our own communities. And I think for time, just quickly say this really briefly. I'm really interested in the way in which Harjo teaches us that poems are not merely an aesthetic object, and that they are, in fact, a relational technology. Memory is a technology, as is time. And in your own work, or this is to poets overall, the question is not what do the horses mean, but perhaps a deeper question is what kind of time do the horses make possible? And who becomes imaginable in that time? And I think I'll end there, but I just briefly want to say, as I close up this particular talk, that it truly was very daunting to do a craft talk on Joy Harjo, because we've had a relationship since I was 22 or so. That started really at Frontier Restaurant with a hamburger that she bought for me, and one of the most beautiful poems that I consider in this entire collection is actually the last poem, which is called "I Give You Back." And I'll just read just a snippet, and then we can get to some questions. And this is from "I Give You Back." I release you, fear, because you hold these scenes in front of me, and I was born with eyes that can never close. I release you, I release you, I release you, I release you. Thank you.
Nick, everybody. Thank you. Because I wanted to talk about your book. I think it's really gorgeous. And first of all, I guess, is it possible to hear a little bit of horses, of the book and of the title poem, potentially?
Sure, yeah. I don't mind. I'll maybe read the first part. Okay. So again, despite the reviewer from Goodreads that said I can't write a long poem, I start Horses with a 12-part poem, and really in honor of Joy Harjo and the kind of lessons I learned from she had some horses. So this is Horses, Part 1, Carrier. First, the sky pronounced on red soil, its want to be more holy, to be more whole. Its promise, its gesture like a rock up a gentle slope, or one long body wrapped around a map, a curved mirror. It carries time and emissions shifted through scattered grasses over a 6 to 9 month period, a hum, adrift, aloft, alone, a gallery of altitudes, and at any given time a field of regard, a field of snow, a field of too much light. There, a wasp, a glottis, a stirring of teeth, the letters we carry over the spit of high moon and morning coffee, somewhere in a canyon, on the roadway, a sudden river washing away God. We become lightning sometimes, and there, only then become song, carry our ache, its kick, pull, haul, hull, become dark cattle, a body of water, the mouth around light, dark clouds leaping into a cold wind.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Really beautiful, and it goes from there. That's just where it starts. It actually starts. There's a pre-poem as well. Mm-hmm. Actually, there's a which is kind of almost a silence in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I love that. I love your talk. I love how much you talked about. Your talk really reminded me of a quote that that I read of yours in an interview, and this is. You describing the title poem, which we just heard from a little bit. You say you wanted to carry the poem across pages. So from there we spiral and meander across the Navajo Nation, through space and time, through language, until we arrive at the promise of the next world. I really love that arrival at promise and the concept of the next world. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about some other ways that time, space, language, and promise enter the poems in Horses. I think we heard you talk really beautifully about time and temporality in Joy's work, and how that influenced you. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe what that promise might look like?
I don't think I know what the promise looks like. I I say in the book that I wanted to write about joy or write about towards this possibility or this idea of futurity. But when I read a book like She Had Some Horses, even joy is sort of resting in a kind of liminal space between this world and a possible next one. And I think perhaps that's where poets are really thrive and sort of showing us the contextuality of both of a both world dynamic, for instance, right? So like there's a previous world and then there's a next world in some ways. So I feel like the condition of being human is kind of like stuck in between, almost at that threshold, right? And I started riding horses at the height of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, when for some reason I was getting a lot of requests to write about the apocalypse. I think a lot of us were thinking about the end of the world because the pandemic sort of really did shift, quite in some spaces quite drastically, right? The ways in which we conduct business as people, right? We switched to Zoom, we stayed home, we were doing things a lot differently. And I was thinking in that moment that I feel like there was such an opportunity to develop a society that was even better than before. But I feel like we just sort of ricocheted right back, and maybe even farther back, right? Since then. But I don't know if there's a particular promise that's identified, but I am hopeful that the poems don't leave the reader sort of left in a kind of like devastation. I do hope that there's a kind of like that we're waiting for the morning, right? And I think I really borrowed the imagery from Joy Harjo's work.
I'm so glad you brought the apocalypse into this, because I do think that image of the horses that you writing about, but also that you describe so evocatively, is an apocalyptic image, I'm thinking a lot about those deaths of those animals that was fueled by thirst, which was fueled by drought, which was fueled by climate change, presumably. So would you call the book an eco-poetics in that sense? Just talk a little bit about that, if you can, and the apocalypse, maybe more.
I think so, yeah. I think most queer poems are an eco-poetics in a way. And I think when I was writing the book, I was trying to sort of maybe separate the two. Like, let me write about ecological disaster, and then in another book I'll write about my queer desire poems, right? Because I thought that they couldn't coexist at once. But with Joy's work and other poets that I've read, like Brian Tier, in Doomsday Days, I began to sort of really see that they're actually quite similar. The queer existence and the existence of land are actually very much tied to each other. The way we treat land is the way we treat bodies, right? So it felt very natural then to sort of just write into a desire. And my main questions began to be things like, how do we feel joy in a time like this? Or how do we experience desire in a time like this, right? When often desire can sometimes feel so selfish, right? When you're sort of thinking about things I should be doing to enact some type of change. So I think it was a question that really carried over from my first book, because in my first book is also about tragedy, dealing with this border town, dealing with this violence. But then I have poems about Grindr in it, right? So it's like, how do I balance the two? And I keep thinking for some reason that they're on separate planes. But the more and more I write into it, I'm learning that they're actually just one and the same.
Right, the layers of human experience. And I'm thinking about that a lot. I have a poem that I also wrote about the pandemic, and it's a sort of a human connection amidst all this dying and death. And it just feels, it felt really important to say, but also important to have that conjunction at the same time. I love this other quote from that same interview when you're talking about the quote, the ways Native experience can be cannibalized by an American market. You're talking about the Richard Avedon photo that's on the cover of your first book. But it gets me thinking about about white gaze and about the settler point of view. Sometimes on my grumpy days, I think about nature poetry in America as a kind of colonization, as a kind of settler point of view, particularly the white lyric. I'm wondering, is that something that you felt as well? And how do you use? What does your view of the lyric poem change as a result of that, and your use of it as well?
I think well. I don't think my use of the lyric changes. I think my use of the lyric is almost inherent. I think most Native and Indigenous poets have a very distinct relationship with land, so much so that it does sort of naturally show up or organically show up in ways that it doesn't in nature poetry. But I think of like anthologies like Black Nature or Queer Nature, right? Those anthologies that sort of talked about how identities that are, commonly referred to as being on the margin, right, are understanding land in a particular way. But you're right, an eco-poetic, especially within a sort of a larger American tradition, has been particularly colonial in that sort of treating land as, again, an aesthetic object, right? And even poetry, right? The American poetry has sort of seen a poem as an aesthetic object. But I think like most Native Indigenous poets like Harjo are sort of have already shown us, right, that's not the case. That poetry is a particular kind of energy, a particular kind of power, and one of the strangest things that happened with Eyes Bottled Dark, because I never considered myself an eco poet or a poet who sort of engages with any type of ecology, but once Eyes Bottled Dark came out, and probably even with this one more so. People have been sort of like labeling me, compartmentalizing me into like, oh, eco poet, right? Poet who writes about nature, who writes about land. But I don't see it in that type of way. I see it more so as just writing poetry that happens to be right, sort of situated in these places. But it's just a condition of the market, right? The ways in which the market tries to label or language a particular thing in a way to leave it open for readership. But from a Native perspective, it's also like a cannibalizing of particular work.
Right. And I love your resistance of that. And you were talking a little bit about the a point of view of a poem as like a destination or as a singularity or as not something kind of separated from time and context and culture. Thank you. I had something smarter to say as a result of that, but I've completely lost it. So I'll talk about structure. Another thing that you talk about in the end of the book, the notes, by the way, are super fascinating, so definitely don't sleep on those, but is that the book is structured using numbers that have significance in Diné culture, specifically 2, 4, 6, and 12, those numbers. And we know that the title sequence is a 12-part sequence. So I love that integration of like art making and life ways. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of building the book through those numerical frameworks and at what point they entered your thinking in the composition process?
I think it actually began with the number 102, actually quite specifically. In Diné sort of thought and life ways, 102 is particularly important. But it's also it's like a simple game too, where we have 102 sort of movements within a particular game that we play back home. And so my initial goal with Horses was to have it be exactly 102 pages, just to honor that kind of like tradition, to sort of speak toward where I come from. But with these longer sequences, I began to realize how they naturally fell into 12s or 6s or 4s or 2s. But with that sort of even number, it could never really fall into 102 pages. And so I introduced like the triptych or the 3-part poem to kind of mess up that sort of flow or that mathematics. So the number three is not particularly important in Diné thought, but the number three or the triptych is particularly important in New Mexico regional history, right? If you think about the colonial powers that came through the American Southwest, and that the way in which the triptych as an art form has sort of really identified a lot of the style of New Mexico and Arizona. So by introducing the triptych or these threes, made it actually turn out into 102 pages, at least in the manuscript version. Of course, publishing and all that will sort of shifted all of that, but initially the manuscript was exactly 102 pages. And it actually reminded me of weavers. So, Navajo rugs, Navajo weavers, I'm pretty sure you all know the designs and the rugs. They're actually imperfect designs. So there's a particular kind of mathematics involved. I don't exactly know the structure, but what I know is that Navajo weavers will purposely warp or introduce an imperfection in the design in order to make it fit on the loom, right? And that needs to occur. The rug can't be perfectly symmetrical. It needs to have some moment of asymmetry, which really helped me think about the book then through those numbers, through that idea of like imperfection as a condition of art making.
I want to ask you about the failed glossary as well in the book, and your framing of that glossary. I'm a very early learner of my native language, and so I really appreciate the contextualization and also the resistance of of the trap of representation, as I like to think of it, where you somehow you speak for all Diné people or language learners or poets working from a Diné worldview. So yeah, can you talk about how you maintain a balance between culture and representation, and also allow yourself to learn on the page, because that's also something you talk a little bit about. That this is you're not an expert. You're learning. You're learning in real time on the page, the way that the reader may be learning with you. It's something that I'm still learning. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you answered it in the question. I initially didn't want a glossary, and I think that's generally the position that most Native poets take, is that we don't need a glossary, because again, meaning is not something that's situated in a kind of logic or comprehension for us, specifically within the kind of Navajo literary or poetic tradition. I think of other Navajo poets who have come before me, who refuse outright to provide translation. I think of the poet Rexley Jim, the late Rexley Jim, unfortunately, who passed earlier this year. But he wrote entire poems in Navajo and would give readings and offer no translation. And he would just ask those in the audience who didn't understand just to listen to the words and how they sounded, and that would be the poem enough, right? But in this case, I was wanting to sort of like position myself as a learner, and hopefully then the reader also as a learner, and have this kind of like moment of exchange in a way. And it's a failed glossary because those are not, they're probably not the only translations of the words that I include. I worked with my partner on their translations, and those are the ones that we sort of came across and sort of like were fine with, right? But I'm pretty sure other Navajo speakers or poets will be like, no, that's wrong. This is actually what it says. But I think that kind of discourse and the variation, is actually really important, right?
I mean, for me, I feel so much shame around my language learning, and worry that I'm going to get an insecurity. Maybe it's not shame, but maybe it's more insecurity that I'm getting it wrong, or that somehow I'm using it in a tokenizing way, rather than a way that's about my own. My own poetics. So I think it's really beautiful, and I do feel like I'm learning from you in real time as well. So before I turn things over to the audience for audience questions, I just wanted to talk. You're the current and third Navajo Nation Poet Laureate, and I'd love for you to talk. I have the privilege of having learned a little bit about your project, so I'd love for you to talk about it, because I think it's really inspiring, and kind of what's fueling the project as well. If you could, the SAD prize as well. Is it SAD or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I got the Navajo Nation Poet Laureateship, I launched an art project called Hotso, actually, which is, funny enough, a section title because it's one of my favorite Navajo words, Hotso. It means like meadow or like a field or like a depression in the ground that's covered with like weeds and flowers and, what you can see as a meadow. And the great thing about Hotso is that you can add so many things to it to make it a different word. And so, for instance, back home we have a town called Tenehotso, right? So you sort of just add it to different things as a kind of modifier in a way. And so my art project Hotso, I call it a conceptual art project because I'm really interested in art organizing as art itself. So looking at my poet laureateship as art organizing, and sort of finding out ways I can sort of like fuel various projects that might take shape in a lot of different ways as sort of under that umbrella. So one of those is the Sod Prize that I launched this year with the Navajo Technical University back home, where we are sort of looking at this idea of civic engagement and poetics, because as a Navajo Nation Poet Laureate, right, it's a little complicated for a state poet laureate, a city poet laureate, the United States poet laureate. It makes sense that civic engagement is part of that process, right? So, like for instance, Ada Lamone's poetry in public parks, right? Joy Harjo's living anthology of Native poets around the country, right? Those types of things that make space, that specifically make poetry public, right? But within the context of a tribal sovereign nation, it doesn't operate in the same way, right? That kind of civic engagement and civic imagination is different. So really the Sod Prize is a way to incubate perhaps what that looks like, right? How do Diné poets, Diné writers, Diné communities sort of think about government or public life or public discourse in a way, because we can't really fully embrace civic engagement because we're still a sovereign nation, right? So we're kind of positioned in this dual citizenship away, and so I really am using the Sod Prize to help us and the word Sod means word in Navajo, or language or voice, for instance, and so really trying to get it to help others think with me. So this year, the theme was on verbs. So what does a verb mean in a particular way as it relates to the net public life, right? Next year, if I get funding, hopefully with several applications out, it's going to be called Chapter House. This idea of like Navajos on the reservations, in rural spaces, and in urban spaces, because I've been on tour for horses since late March. And in every town and city I visited, there's been one Navajo audience member. So I feel like creating that kind of kinship across time and space, I think is really important for me as well.
That's so beautiful. Does the audience have any questions? And also, I would like to invite people from the Zoom call as well to ask questions, and Mike will field them for you. He'll be your voice.
Mine's a little vague, but you peppered throughout your talk about the idea of becoming, and you spoke of futurism. And I was wondering if you saw how you related the horse to that, if you saw the horse as somehow a vehicle for that, and how you may think, how you're structuring that idea, or how when you actually put the poem together, how maybe you're structuring that idea of becoming so that someone like the reader can essentially saddle the horse and take that for a ride. So.
And again, I think you answered the question in your question.
Oh,
right?
Good, thank you.
That's all. No, but I mean, I think with Harjo's work and the work that I was doing, also just sort of echoing her work as well, is that horses are something we take journeys on, for instance, right? And in the idea of becoming, at least from a Dene way of thinking, there is no destination to that journey, right? Whereas in a kind of settler point of view, settler temporality, there is a destination. You know, sea to shining sea to shining sea, right? This idea of like settling, of you know, settling into a particular place. And like just like I mentioned, between that dichotomy of like an old world and a new world, right? I mean, even the Americas were called the New World for quite some time, because again, there was this the sort of the sea between them was this kind of threshold, right? But there was always a destination at the end that we would settle into this new place. But from my way of thinking, and I think what Harjo and I are maybe trying to do on the page is sort of show that there is no destination because we haven't reached it yet. And even if we don't see it or know what it is, we just have to keep journeying toward it, which is why I think horses are sort of a big part of that lexicon, perhaps, or vocabulary. I think it's in one of the ways I'm just questioning too about it. I don't think I arrived at an answer, and I'm hoping that the reader is okay that there's no answer at the end, right? That there is no arrival. We're not arriving somewhere. But it's on the horizon, right? So I'm thinking about it through that way.
Is it more of an opening than an arriving? Yeah.
Yeah, more of an opening, more of a becoming, right? Yeah.
I remember that I wanted to ask you about the repetition and having it, especially of the word horses, and having it become kind of a hoofbeat throughout the book, throughout Joy's poem, but also potentially your book. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Maria Elisa?
Yes. Thanks, Jake. This was fascinating. I was very interested when you said that Joy resists or challenges the idea of closure in her poems. And I wonder if you also if you also do that in your own poetry, especially like after finishing a book and publishing a book. How do you resist closure in your poetry and in horses?
That's a good question. I have been doing a lot of thinking about the poetry collection or the book as a kind of artifact, right? Because it does sort of feel kind of final to have a book published, right? And with Eyes Bottle Dark, my first book, the publication process was so fast because it was through the National Poetry Series. So I did feel a kind of anxiety around that kind of finality of like, oh wait, let me take one more look at it, right? So when it came out, the first thing I did was go through and I started editing it. And of course, all poets do this. Of course, they edit the poems as a way to sort of like just continue thinking through it. But with horses, this time around, I asked for time between when the book was accepted and when it was published. So the book was picked up in 2023, so almost 3 years ago, and it's finally coming out now because I wanted that time to really just sit with this idea of it being out in the world. And I think that really did inspire a lot of the moves I made in it. And from my point of view as the poet technician behind the book, it does come to kind of like, in my view, kind of an abrupt ending. And I'm hoping that the reader does pick up on that we're sort of just like, we end, just to resist some of that finality a bit. That again, there is no closure here. There's no arriving somewhere, right? And I think that's why the notes at the end were super important. So I can sort of put myself on the page and be like, this is what I mean. Don't worry. I know that we didn't get anywhere, but you know, that this journey meant something or should mean something, hopefully, right?
I think it does. Other questions?
Thank you so much. That was really great. I have a little question around identities. So, queer identity, indigenous identity, being so the tension between coming out, being known, and being boxed in by an identity. How do you feel that, and how do you deal with that? In other words, by coming out or identifying yourself, putting yourself out there as an indigenous, a queer person, anything else, etc. There's always the danger also that people then put you into that box and look at you in a way that they think you should be or would be. Have you experienced that? And again, how do you deal with that, and what do you make of that?
I think so, and I think most people will deal with that kind of the kind of like rigid kind of identity markers and labels. I think as someone who's coming from Navajo or the Navajo Nation, there is a particular tension and in the kind of like queer and Navajo identity, but I'm really just comforted by our language and traditions, because as I'm learning this language, right, more and more, I'm beginning to sort of see the way in which a masculinity and femininity are sort of like always present, and that's the idea that those energies exist in all people, and so I think, and when you sort of frame that, then of course against a sort of a settler power, right? I'm comforted by the fact that all indigenous identity is inherently queer, right? And if and this is really just for Native people specifically, right? And I think I made this sort of gesture at AWP recently, where I made this huge, grandiose statement of like all indigenous literature is queer literature, and I'm pretty sure that there are some Native authors who might sort of like be a little bit shocked by that, right? Of those rigidity and identity, but no, I'm very comforted by my culture. But of course, in the larger mainstream study, yes, of course, I'm always dealing with how are people going to introduce me as queer poet, queer indigenous poet? Like what does that mean? But I'm always, but of course, naturally, I'm always trying to press against language as I can anyway. So, yeah, that's a good question, though. Thank you.
I do sometimes think that. I was talking a little bit earlier about the trap of representation, and when I was an earlier career poet, and I came across the work of Craig Santos Perez, I felt like I was like, amazing. Also, oh no, because there was another Chamorro poet who's much more kind of established, and and who's been very kind of amazing person to follow as an example, but also and I think sometimes the answer isn't do I represent this? It's that we need to publish more Native authors. We need to publish so that you can be individual as well, right? It's not, you're not representing something. You're writing your poems, right? It's a little bit of both. As the Navajo Nation Poet Laureate, I'm sure that there's a little different pressure on that.
Yeah. No, there's a huge one, because I know that my books won't be particularly suitable for high schoolers, for instance. And I feel like a poet laureate job is always talking to youth. So I'm always under pressure of like, how do I frame my work to children and to high schoolers in a way that feels acceptable, right? And I had this huge identity crisis too. I was invited to read in front of the Navajo Nation president, and my first thought was, how am I going to read these poems about hookups in front of the Navajo Nation president? Because there is a kind of like, air, it's something you sort of feel, like reciting a poem in front of that type of government or that type of bureaucracy, I feel like is different. So, yeah, I'm always dealing with that type of pressure all the time.
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
We have a question from the audience, the Zoom audience. This is from Masfi. Compared to other creatures, What makes the horses specifically an evocative symbol for movement and transformation for your and Joy Harjo's work?
That's a good question. Thank you. I'm particularly drawn to the horse because I know that the horse is a colonial animal, for instance, right? It was brought over by colonization. In fact, most of Navajo thought and lifeway is inspired by that contact. So, for instance, sheep, right, is a huge part of our lifeway, but that's not indigenous to here. A lot of our language is borrowed by other languages. So, for instance, the Navajo word for butter is mandagia, right? Our Navajo word for money is peso, after peso. And a lot of our clothing, the designs that we wear, the colors, right? The idea of Navajo chief blankets and the introduction of the color blue, right, was only possible through contact. Horses then are kind of this very interesting nexus being of all these different histories and temporalities existing all at once. But and I'm also particularly interested again in the American mythos, right, of the horse, right, the frontier, wild horses, wild stallions, right. And native cultures have really adopted horses as very much part of their identities. And I think, of course, across plain cultures, the now where I come from is not particularly a horse culture, but we do have Navajo horse songs that are sung in honor of these particular animals. But I think part of the simple beauty about it is that these animals, though introduced to us through this sort of often violent contact, were sort of then put to use to better communities, right? So horses became useful because of travel, right? To better, build your agricultural things, right? And sheep, for instance, specifically for Navajo, sheep are a big part of our lives because they are not only food, they are tools, they're clothing, right? And it really informs our way of becoming around, a single animal. That's a good question, though.
Okay, well, I'll wrap it up with one final question. Poet laureate, Navajo Nation, you're on the board of Indigenous Nations Poets. You have been teaching at the University of Oklahoma, and you're now about to start teaching at the University of New Mexico. Somehow, you're also doing this amazing project, through the auspices of your position as the Navajo Nation Poet Laureate. But that's also a continuation of all these other projects that you've done previously as well, like Pollen Tongue and some of the other, kind of related projects. I think community building is something that you do particularly well. I'm reminded of Anne Waldman's sort of like mythical I forget how she frames it. It's like the infrastructural poet, somebody who's, a poet that kind of creates not just the art, but the structure through which art is made possible, right? So how do you? The question is, how do you find time to write? And what is coming next for you? I kind of know this answer a little bit, but I'd love to hear you say it.
I think poetry for me is probably the easiest thing to write or find time to write because I can write poetry anywhere. Right? I mean, I can write poem when I'm on a plane. Eyes But All Dark itself, my first book was written entirely on the light rail in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was living. So commute from my apartment to work and back. Horses was written as I was finishing up a novel. So I feel like poetry has the ability where you can set it down, step away, and then immediately pick it right back up again. Whereas, what's upcoming is the novel. I don't know if that's a bad word in Poet's House, but
we'll forgive you.
But so it's a novel that I wrote, but I could only write it because I had a dedicated residency for it. So I had a year at John Grisham's house in Oxford, Mississippi, which is a very strange sentence to say now that I think about it. Navajo poet in John Grisham's house. But I finished Horses in 2023, right when the residency started. So I was already pretty much done with this book. So I was, just sitting in Grisham's house, and I had this, and I was working towards these fiction pieces as I was writing Horses. So then I began to just like sit down every day and write. And novels really do require intensity. So that idea of like you have to write every day, I never really thought it applied to me, because I don't write every day as a poet. But as a novelist, as a prose writer, you do have to write every day. You have to sit down and be sort of in the novel, in the story, in the characters. It's a kind of endurance that you don't have to have with poetry, I think, oh, maybe you do, but it's just a different kind. I think the intimacy with poetry that I have is a bit more calming, and I can sort of slow things down, or I think novels are kind of more energy forward. Yeah, but that's what's upcoming.
Amazing. I always joke that poets are more fun because poets have more time. Thank you so much, Jake Skeets. This was really incredible. Give it up for Jake Skeets.
Thank you. Thank you so
and
much.
Also,
Thank you.
Joy Harjo, wherever you are in the world, we appreciate you as well. Thank you all for coming. And don't forget that there are books for sale in the lobby. We have Joy's as well as Jake's. And thank you all so much for coming.